Hey everyone, it's Chad,
Leo?
and we are the Marshals of Truth. So we're going to be starting out our third episode of our series on deterrence. And to start out, we're going to just to recap on what we talked about in part two. In part two, we talked about the United States plan for nuclear war. We used an example and showed a couple different maps, and then we also used I believe another point on a targeting list and other things of that sort. But the biggest point that we made in part two was emphasizing that the devastation and the tragedy caused by a nuclear war was one of the biggest things that has kept world leaders and governments from choosing nuclear war or choosing conventional war itself as an option. And so with that episode, we emphasized how deterrence has so far worked and how um, as I said, the prospect of nuclear war is what has kept a lot of world leaders from choosing conventional war. And so with this one, we're gonna pick up on the idea of deterrence by looking at it at a different level. So with the idea of deterrence, one of the most important things is for deterrence to be believed. It has to be mutual. So the other side has to believe that your side will credibly and reliably be able to destroy their country should they choose to attack you. And so, if that country doesn't believe in your deterrence, what's to stop them from fighting a war against you? They might become more aggressive and they might, go forward with some plan that would still eventually lead to nuclear war. And so, with that, we're going to get started on our first example, and I'll hand it off to Khalil.
All right. So, again, in the second episode, we talked about the US plan. And in this episode, we'll mainly be talking about the Soviet plan. As the 50s and 60s dragged on, the Soviets began to bridge a lot of the missile gap that there was between the two countries. Now, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, up until that point, in the American and Soviet publics, there was believed to be a missile gap, but against the Americans' favor, but really it was the other way around. Now, in the last episode, we talked about, I think it was the last episode, we talked about Khrushchev's belief of deterrence and his lack of belief in conventional weapons. Now, the interesting thing about what we'll be talking about mainly in this episode with the Soviet war plan is that it actually relied more heavily upon conventional weapons. That it was a bit of a reverse from Khrushchev's original idea of how deterrence worked, because he recognized there to be certain gaps, certain breaks within the Western alliance. So, um, to quote the parallel, oh wait, let's see here. Well, basically, with the throughout the 60s, there was a little bit of a break in the Western alliance. The French president Charles de Gaulle, the war hero in World War II, um, was threatening to pull France out of NATO because a lot of the problems that were being introduced um, with their colonies in Indochina, mainly with Vietnam. And America, they were also like starting to station a lot more of their troops into Vietnam, pulling away a lot of their focus from Europe. And so the Soviets, still led under Khrushchev, began to get a little bit more, how should I say, more aggressive in their
A
planning.
little more eager to start the fight.
Yeah, exactly. They thought, they had an original war plan in the early 60s and where they were relying on a bit of a counter offensive. At the very end of our last episode, we talked about how like they actually were ready to put boots on the ground and invade territory by conventional means, only if the West, led by America, were to drop bombs on their side, in a first strike. That their second strike wouldn't be in the means of of nukes necessarily. It would be through conventional means. But as these flaws in the Western alliance were beginning to be exposed, Khrushchev began planning for a first strike, but again, not through nukes, but through conventional means. So I just want to show you a bit of this plan known as 7 Days to the Rhine, in where Khrushchev, when I have a really good map here that shows the axis of attack, they planned on aligning troops near the East German Czechoslovakian border as well, and invading Austria to the south, and then cutting out to the west towards Western Germany, and then another axis of advance from the main part of East Germany through this area called Fulda. This is called the Fulda Gap, and where it's about 150 kilometers straight shot to the French border. And then from the north, they would attack Denmark and secure it pretty quickly because their army is very small, and they would overrun the Netherlands and Belgium. So yeah, I mean, it was a pretty interesting plan that they had here because it did not rely on an American or Western first strike. And so, like, because France was not part of NATO and they planned on taking out NATO as a supposed threat to Russia, that they would just take every other country nearby, which was not too far from the Iron Curtain borders, which were cut through Germany at the time. And so they kept in mind certain geographical restraints. I talked about geographical restraints in the last series with the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs, and about as it related to Operation Downfall. But again, through here, because I'm quite big on geography, it was really interesting how they kept in mind like those restraints. The Fulda Gap was an area between like the German mountains as a bit of an extension of the Italian Alps. How they were going to they're going to drive troops, drive tanks and move troops through this area, which wasn't as mountainous as the areas around it to the French border near Saarbrücken. Um, and they would also put in a lot of troops near the extension of the North European plain. And so they wouldn't have as much of a problem in securing these areas in Western Europe, um, versus um, versus trying to get through these mountains and potentially compromising the operation. They planned on getting from the East German border to France, in where they hoped that Western leaders would capitulate and sign a peace treaty within about a week. They planned on getting to the Vosges Mountains here, this mountain range near the French capital over here, Paris, within about 5 or 6 days. And considering that the East German border was only about 150, 200 miles from there, it was not too hard to believe.
Yeah, this is why the plan is called the 7 Days to the Rhine, because the Rhine River, which goes through what was Western Germany at the time, isn't too far from the border. And so the Russians expected that they would get through most of Western Germany by utilizing things like the Fulda Gap and just usually just their manpower, like overpowering against NATO. They believed that they would take Western Germany and get to the Rhine River, which it's can be kind of seen as a border of Germany within a week. That's why it's called the 7 Days to the Rhine. You hear about that pretty common in NATO war planning and basically throughout the Cold War of like the USSR's plans.
Yeah. So again, with these geographical restraints, they recognized that like in any French war plan, they were going to use the River Rhine, which again is a bit more of like a border to them, against like where a lot of German invasions have come through, because the Germans, they invaded like through their western border and the Rhine, um, and bypass the Vosges Mountains, like in the Franco-Prussian War in the 1870s, again in World War One, then in World War Two. And the French, like the Soviets, knew that if they ever invaded again, that the French would not take it lightly, and so they planned on just overrunning them as fast as possible, so they would have no way of responding. Um, so like they just wanted to shock them into submission. Now this plan, it's very bold and it's very quick, and it's really interesting. And what's most interesting about it is a little bit of a conspiracy, a little bit of a historical conspiracy, and that is the possibility that it might have actually been, if I can find the quote here. Um, might take a little while, but basically there was a quote here on this report on the seventh day to the Rhine plan
We'll
by
have
the
it in the description.
project. Yeah, we'll put it in the description. But basically, it it exposed a potential uh, the the possibility that Khrushchev was taken out of office on October 14th, 1964, because that day he planned on putting troops on the ground for such an invasion of Western Europe. There might be a possibility, and we still don't know to this day. Like more Russian documents, like that are still holed up in the Kremlin, would have to be released for us to know for sure. And it's been almost 60 years, and it's still classified. So who knows? Maybe it did happen, and they're just trying to cover it. But there might be a possibility that the Russians indeed did plan on invading Western Europe. That Khrushchev actually gave it a red light, like gave it a green light. Sorry. Um, and it was that day that the Politburo and other generals, they took him out of power because they recognized that that would be the end of humankind.
Yeah. And so what's interesting about this whole plan and this whole setup by the Russians through the 7 days to the Rhine operation was the assumption that it didn't need to involve nukes and it didn't need necessarily to be a response to a NATO provocation or attack or anything like that. The fact that it was being planned and not relying on being attacked first, and it seemed like it was about to be implemented anyways. The fact that it was done in spite of the West and the United States and other countries like the United Kingdom and France having nukes was one that was significant.
Right. Now there are a couple quotes that I wanna bring forth, and we're trying to finish this episode in 30 minutes. So there's gonna be a section of where Chad gets to talk, but I just want to show you a quote that I was able to find from this site called Russia Beyond, which gave a really interesting historical report on on this war plan, and it justified the Russian decision to draw up war plans by saying by not nuking the U.S., France, and the United Kingdom, because again this was going to be a conventional effort. By not nuking the United States, France, and United Kingdom, the Soviets wanted to create division between the Western Allies. They knew that not NATO General Command, but the US, French, and British leadership decided separately how and when to use their nuclear weapons. By such a maneuver, the USSR would give them a hard choice whether to use their nuclear weapons against the Soviets and be certainly nuked in return, to fight with no use of nuclear capabilities, or even stay outside the conflict. With France's complicated relations with NATO, which had left in 1966, such a perspective wasn't quite unbelievable. After nuclear strikes were done, the Soviet and Czechoslovakian armies planned to break through the enemy lines towards the River Rhine. Since in tanks, they outnumbered the alliance several times, they were sure of success. So, this is they used a very interesting idea of reversing the idea of deterrence. They thought that if they didn't nuke the West, you know, and they didn't nuke the particular three countries within NATO that had nukes at the time, then they would feel no reason to nuke them back. You know, and with the speed of their advance, like the leaders of those countries would be debating so much amongst themselves that they wouldn't know what to do, you know. And then from that, because of that like dilemma, like they're being invaded, but they don't want to nuke. They don't want to nuke the Soviets because if they did, then they would be dead themselves. It was a really, really hard decision between them, or at least it would be if this actually happened. Um, so yeah, I mean, it just was, it was a really interesting idea here. And potentially, if those Kremlin documents could be released, we'll have an idea of how close we were to nuclear Armageddon. But yeah.
Yeah. Once again, with this plan, one of the most significant things that we saw in just its aggression and the kind of eagerness that was evident for it to even happen was the Soviets' doubt in NATO's credible deterrence. As we saw, they took advantage of France leaving NATO in 1966, as well as the United States involvement in Vietnam, France's involvement in Vietnam, and kind of division between the West. And in they interpreted that as the West not having a credible deterrence. So this
And
means they didn't believe that United Kingdom, Germany, I mean not Germany, France, United States would respond effectively with nuclear strikes should they go forward with the operation, but rather that they could go forward with a devastating conventional conflict because they didn't feel like the West was going to respond.
And remember, this plan was about to potentially have gone through in 64. The plans were being drawn up, but of course it couldn't have been off of the guarantee that France was going to leave NATO because it didn't leave until 66. So you might be thinking a bit of a contradiction there. But by 64, because it takes a long time for nations to join NATO, we say that with Ukraine. Um, um, it also takes a long time to officially leave NATO. So it might have been, and we'll have to double check for sure. But by 1964, de Gaulle had already said publicly that he was going to take France out of NATO, and so therefore the Soviets would work around that. So just to clear up that potential contradiction, you might be thinking, there's that.
Yeah. So, like I said, they took advantage of division and stated that as they didn't believe that deterrence was credible. And so, this is a key part of deterrence in that it has to go both ways. The other side has to believe, as I said at the start of the video, they have to believe that they will be credibly destroyed, annihilated, and not be able to fight a war should that war start. And the Soviet Union took the divisions between NATO, France, United States. They took that as they wouldn't credibly be destroyed. And so with that, they were very eager to start a conventional conflict, which very likely would have led to a nuclear exchange and therefore nuclear Armageddon. And so, at the end of the day, the eagerness for this plan to go forward, regardless of nuclear first strikes, just showed how deterrence needs to be strong. And so a country's deterrence has to be effective, it has to be modern, it has to work. The enemy has to believe, whether that enemy's Russia or China or whatever, they have to believe that they will be taken out in not just their leaders or their military, but their civilian population or their entire world goals, that they must be taken out in a nuclear exchange. And so this is why it's important that countries like the United States need modern nuclear arsenals. And so this is where we get kind of into another more modern example of how this is taking place in the United States. Um, so after President Obama was elected in 2008, one of his biggest goals publicly was for global denuclearization, or, countries giving up their nuclear weapons. Um, just as a goal itself, it's pretty unrealistic. It's not likely that we would get the Russians or the Chinese to give up their nuclear weapons. But the goal of it was to end up getting more arms reduction treaties and more safeguards put around their nuclear weapons so that they're not used again. However, after I believe even Obama got a Nobel Peace Prize for his initiative with that. But in the years following, the Obama administration invested millions, if not billions, into modernizing the United States nuclear fighting force. And this was seen in U.S. politics as very contradictory or hypocritical or going against kind of what we said already of wanting to get I mean, from our perspective, it looks like Obama was saying he wanted to get rid of nukes, but then simultaneously gives a bunch of money to make more nukes and more effective nukes. And this was basically done to just kind of give an overview. Some of the programs that were funded in around 2012 was a program which is still in effect now for 12 new ballistic missile submarines to replace our aging Ohio class submarines. And this would be about 100 billion over about 30 or so years. I mean, they take a lot to build. And then another project was about $55 billion being invested to a new stealth bomber. We know this now is the B-21 Raider, and it's going to be replacing the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber and possibly the B-1 bomber, possibly even the B-52, but that thing's not going away for 100 years. But and then another project along with that was the modernization of the B-61 gravity bomb. And so with this program, it's called the Mod 12, and it upgrades these bombs to be GPS guided and basically more accurate and have more accurate fusing systems. And they invested at the time around 178 million to kind of refurbish those old bombs and get them up to speed. And that also gets them, to be dropped by like fighter planes and other bombers. At the end of the day, the goal of these modernizations are to make sure that the United States nuclear fighting force is able to be adaptable not adaptable, but able to just work in the 21st century. In order for our enemies to believe that we will take them out in a nuclear war, we have to make sure that the bombs that we drop aren't going to fizzle out or they aren't going to miss. The enemy needs to know that they will be hit and they will be taken out. And so it's important that we have a strong, incredible nuclear deterrent force in our military. And so as has kind of been shown, this requires sometimes upgrades, sometimes refurbishment, or sometimes just making whole new weapons. And we have that now with the United States is getting a new intercontinental ballistic missile to replace our old systems. It's another very expensive program, which of course has caught in the ire of a lot of politicians and just people in general. But the goal of this is that the United States needs to have a strong deterrent because we need our adversaries to believe in deterrence itself. They need to believe that they don't want to get into a war because they will die as well. The 7-day plan, as we just went over, the 7 days to the Rhine, as we just went over, showed what happens if the opposing force does not believe in deterrent. They'll be more eager to start a conventional war. They'll be more eager to strike us, our allies, or any other of our interests in whatever region, because they don't believe that any conventional conflict or any conflict in general would lead to a nuclear exchange. They think that they could win. They think that they could win whatever war it is and not suffer the millions upon millions of deaths that would be caused in a nuclear war. And so that's, like I said, that's what happens when the other side doesn't believe in deterrence, which shows that it needs to be both ways. And so both sides have to be strong in that kind of effect.
Right. So, this does not go without downsides. There are major risks and miscalculations with the political pro-use anxiety. It's like thing about nuclear deterrence is that while it can prevent war, it also has the potential of allowing human rights abuses. Like Putin is using nuclear blackmail to allow anything that might happen in Ukraine short of a nuclear bomb being dropped on its territory to kill as many Ukrainian civilians as possible to make the Zelensky government falter. And that may mean that hundreds of thousands or even millions more Ukrainians can die just with this mindset.
Just
Like,
to add on to that point, that's another reason why, we don't have the United States in NATO fighting Russia over Ukraine, because Russia has nuclear weapons. Because of deterrence, because we believe that they will strike us with nukes if we fight them back. That's why we're not fighting them, because we believe that they have a credible deterrent, and they do. They have 6,000 nuclear weapons that they could potentially use on us and others in the world. ridiculously dangerous. And so that's a reason why we aren't going to war with Russia and stopping their invasion of Ukraine, is because Putin, especially now, has been a lot more publicly, he's been a lot more open to the possibility of using nuclear weapons, or if not using them, threatening them, because the threats themselves are effective when deterrence is around, because that stops both sides from wanting to fight. And so that means us not being involved in Ukraine and just the war going on, thousands of more civilians dying, and thousands of soldiers being lost in a war that could be over soon. Who knows?
Which is why it's really interesting to look at just how far you can go before you drop a nuke. Because the thing about Ukraine right now is that while we aren't getting into an actual war, we are sending aid. And so a lot of it is just trying to call his bluff. Because if we were to put troops on the ground and actually help with the Ukrainians to fight, then you can bet that Putin is going to have to go through with his promise. Because Putin, as crazy as it is, you know, he would not have gone this far if he was stupid. And no sane individual wants to start nuclear war. They just have to kind of put lines out there so that no other world leader can stop them. I mean, Putin may be evil, but he's not stupid. He doesn't want nuclear war. If he did, we would have already had it. So he's actually hoping that we don't put troops in Ukraine because he's going to feel obliged to the Russian public, which are really like pro-war right now, to drop those nukes. And when you do drop even one nuke in the modern era, there's the assumption that because the other side is going to know you sent a nuke to them, that they're just going to send their entire arsenal back at you. Because if they're going to die, then we might as well go ahead and send everything. Which means, because of how many nukes, just America, but oh my God, look at Russia has. It's not just enough to wipe out the entire population centers of both countries. That's enough to wipe out the entire European and North American, South American continents, which is a large majority of the human
Right.
population. Like the nuclear fallout could literally spread over the entire world. So, like, if let's say the U.S. helps fighting with the Ukrainians on the front, and Putin feels obliged to send over a nuke, he might as well send over his whole arsenal because he knows that the U.S. is going to respond in kind. So basically, the big challenge over the past few months since the war started in its all-out form, beyond just the separatist fighting in the Donbass, it has been about poking the bear, literally poking the Russian bear. Just trying to see because of course he doesn't want to start nuclear war. That's been proven by the fact that he said in his initial speech, warning to the West the day of the invasion, pre-recorded, like anyone that interferes in this will receive immediate response, and that everyone interpreted that as nukes. And he probably meant that too. But as soon as we started sending aid, we are not nuclear yet. Am I radioactive? I am not radioactive yet. Like literally, like I don't feel radioactive. I'm actually like quite cool right now. I'm not toasty.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not really smelling iodine in the air
Yeah,
just yet, so I think we're doing pretty good.
I don't smell it.
Are
I
you
don't.
green? I mean, I'm wearing a green shirt, but I'm not really glowing green yet.
I think I'm good, guys. I think I'm
Yeah,
good, y'all.
yeah, we're
So
good.
like we have sent aid, in the billions, like in the dozens of billions, enough to have the Ukrainians not only stop the advance, but hopefully over the next few weeks push them back. That's why a lot of analysts have suggested that if we continue with the rate of aid and like even expand it a little bit, then the Ukrainians can possibly push the Russians back to their borders and retake Crimea, retake Donbass, and really humiliate Putin. It's just that we know that we can't give them so much aid that they go across the Russian border, because then that could be interpreted as it is in the Russian military manuals and the way and what is it? Their military doctrine, and where they say that if the existence of the Russian state is threatened, then they will use nukes.
Yeah.
But obviously, retaking Ukrainian territory is not a destruction of the Russian state. So
Hmm.
Biden has been able to tread very carefully and this very cleverly, sending aid, sending foreign troops, but not under the official U.S. or French or British banner, um, and we've been able to really help out the Ukrainians when they probably would have folded by this point without the aid that they've already gotten, and with the aid that's going to be coming over to them in large amounts over the next few weeks and months. So it's really just about like just seeing how far we can go, you know.
Yeah.
And it's proven that Putin doesn't actually want to go to nuclear war, and there's a good reason for that, as we've already mentioned.
Exactly. When we're in an environment where both fingers could be on the trigger for the end of the world, you really had to toe the line if you want something to get done. Because if you just take deterrence at their word from it, then that would mean we can't help Ukraine at all, and we would just be leaving Russia or any nuclear armed country who was attacking a non-nuclear country. We would have to leave them be because we couldn't help because we would fear their retaliation. So
Right,
that's
but
where we are with deterrence.
nothing is worse than neutrality, you know? And as much as people want to say it, we are not neutral. Putin knows we're not neutral, and we know we're not neutral. So, like, we have made a decision. We are going to help the Ukrainian people. Like Biden's gaffes are not gaffes. Like when he says, like this man cannot remain in power, or we have an opportunity here to destroy the Russian military. This is essentially our fight. And Zelensky has explained that really well in his speeches, saying that this is not just the fight of Ukraine, this is the fight for the West. So it's way like we are anything but neutral. So we're just doing everything short of going to war. So we are not actually neutral here. As we explained in our neutrality episode in part 3 of the Truth series, um, we have taken a side. We have looked at both sides and came to a conclusion and determined that Zelensky and Ukraine is on the better side of truth. And so we acted on that.
Yep. Thank you for making that point. We're basically past our time. So, um, yeah, with our next episode, we're gonna look a little more at some of the issues that could come up with deterrence, along with the ones that we mentioned, such as how deterrence can be used to keep others out, theoretically, and how it's up for powers to kind of basically toe the line and see how far they could go before, they cross the line of deterrence. And in our next episode, we'll look at some of the issues on how um, issues such as, miscalculations, communication errors, or just faults in the system could potentially lead to nuclear war, and just how dangerous that having all these nuclear weapons around the world can be. And so we'll be looking at some of the sides on how it might be dangerous. And then another issue that we'll look at is how a very common thing nowadays for leaders is making nuclear weapons accessible and usable, and how there's a lot of pro use fervor in both the United States and, of course, in Russia, and with regards to nuclear weapons and wanting to use them more often. So we'll be taking a look at that side of the argument in that next episode. But yeah,
Yeah, and we'll take the opportunity to not only mention Ukraine as we already did, but to also use another example of how human rights could be violated under the banner of deterrence, like with the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. Now, of course, we also are going to be talking about the things that Chad just mentioned about like the things that may go wrong without communication, proper communication, like the phone line between Khrushchev and Kennedy. But we also we're going to be talking a little bit about the Uyghurs as another example, but hopefully we're not going to go too far with it. There may be a chance we'll go over the 30 minutes with that episode as we did with this one, but without a further ado, we are the Marshals of Truth. We'll see you in a few days. Actually, no, wait. Part 4 is going to be released with part 3, so we'll see you in about 5 minutes when you're done with this episode.
oh yeah, bless the algorithm. Have a good one, everyone.
All right.